All right, everyone. So in the last lecture, we learned that how we can make a fetch request and also display all the items, all the different movies on the screen, as you can see in our Chrome browser. But what we want to do is to refactor this code. What that really means is that currently the fetch request is not really inside a function. It's always a good idea to put things inside a function so that we can reuse them later on. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and create a separate function, and I'll call it fetch movies. And in this function, I'm just going to go ahead and drag and drop all of these things, basically cut and paste. All right, let's see if we can format it. Format document. There we go. Okay. So now we have this fetch movies is a function, and the reason that we don't really display anything on the right side, as you can see, is because the fetch movies function is not yet called. So let's go ahead and call that function. So I'm going to call fetch movies. And when we call that function, it calls all of this, and we basically make a request, and we display all the information on the screen, as you can see. But there are a couple of different things that we can improve about this function. Because right now, if you see, the name of the function is fetch movies. If you just see the name of the function, you will say, oh, this function is going to give me the movies. Which it does. I mean, it does give you the movies in the form of result, and then you also do result.search to get all the movies. But this function is also responsible for displaying the movies. And this means that this particular function has two responsibilities, which is getting the movies and also displaying the movies, or fetching the movies and displaying the movies. So we want to separate this out. This means that all of this code, we want to move it somewhere else. And the reason that we want to move it somewhere else is maybe in the future, we need to get all the movies, but we don't need to execute all of this code. Maybe I just want to get all the movies and then send an email. Maybe I want to fetch all the movies and display it in a completely different interface, right? But right now we cannot, because whenever we call fetch movies, it gets the movies and then it displays it on the UI, user interface. So we need to separate these things out. We need to separate out fetching the movies and also displaying the movies. So two separate functions. So how can we do that? Well, let's go ahead and we will copy all of this part, because all of this part from line number 15 to line number 19, that is the part that is displaying the movies, right? So I'll just copy it from here, and I'll create another function over here. We'll call it display movies. So if you pass in the movies, we will display movies for you. And that's it. Cool, right? There we go. So now we have a display movies function. If you pass an array of movies over here, then we will display all these. But now the question is, well, where should we call display movies? I mean, we are performing fetch movies. You might be saying that, oh, I can just call display movies over here. And yes, it will work, but I think we didn't really solve any problem, because again, when you're performing fetch movies, it is tied up to display movies, meaning it will always call this display movies. Maybe I don't want to call display movies function. Maybe I want to call email movies function, or something else movies function. So I can't really write this over here, because then it will be very much tied up to display movies. Every single time you're going to call fetch movies, it will always call display movies, but I want more flexibility. I don't really want to call display movies all the time. So now the question is, well, once we get the movies, which is on line number 14, how do we return it? Well, that's not really going to work, because you're inside a promise and you can't really return from there, right? And we learned about that a little bit earlier on, that whenever you're performing an async operation, which all of this fetch request is, it's an asynchronous operation, then it returns the stuff, but if you put a line over here, that line has already been executed. So you cannot return from an asynchronous function. Like in a normal function, you can return something, like return array of movies. Over here, you cannot, because this line will get executed first. So what can we do to solve this problem? Well, this means that we will need to use closures or callbacks. And what you're going to do is, when we are using fetch movies, we're going to pass another function inside the fetch movies. All right. Now, what do you want to call that function? That is up to you. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this callback. I mean, you can call it anything you want, by the way. I mean, if you want it to be a little bit more descriptive, you can call it movies fetched callback. I mean, it's just being descriptive. So movies fetch callback will be a function, because what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to pass something to fetch movies. So I'm going to pass in a function. You can see that this function doesn't really have any name. I mean, you can pass an anonymous function like this. That's perfectly fine. So now when you call fetch movies, this function is going to go right here. So what is movies fetch callback? It's the function right there, because that's what we passed in, right? So movies fetch callback is a function, this function right there on line number 26, which does not take any argument. So just use it like a function, meaning you will simply say movies fetch callback and you will simply call the function. This means this particular function is going to get called right over here on line number 28, this anonymous function. And we can go ahead and say, function called or whatever. Function called. Just to see if it's getting called or not. And you can see that it is getting called. But where are the movies? I mean, that was the whole point. We wanted to get the movies, right? So where are the movies? Well, if you look over here on line number 14, we're not really passing anything. And the reason we're not passing anything is because when we passed in a function on line number 27, that function doesn't really take in anything. So what we can do is we can create a function that takes one argument. This movies is just, array of movies. I mean, this movies has nothing to do with anything else, meaning this movies has nothing to do with this movies has nothing to do with this movies. No, it's just a variable. It's just an argument, a function argument. So now when I'm calling the movies fetch callback, I can simply pass in the movies. Again, you can call this anything you want. I mean, if you want, we can change that. Let's go ahead and change it to M. And let's go ahead and print out the value of M. If you run this and we print out the value, you get all the movies, all the 10 movies. All right. So let's do this again. What's going to happen over here is that when you call fetch movies, it's going to call fetch movies and it's going to pass in a function to fetch movies. That function is pointing still to the function that we passed in. So movies fetch callback is a function that takes one argument, which is right there. So if movies fetch callback is a function that takes one argument, well, then it means you can call it like a function that takes one argument. And that's what we're doing. We call movies fetch callback, which basically calls this function, and movies is passed to the movies, or movies is passed to M, and M now contains all the movies, and then we display it. So this means that once we get the movies, which is on line number 28, we can call display movies and pass in M, which should display all the movies, as you can see. M is not really a good name for any function arguments. I'm just going to go ahead and change it to movies. That makes a little bit more sense. And I will change it to movies. All right. So this is going to allow us to, well, this first allowed us to create two functions, fetch movies and display movies. The fetch movie is used to only get you the movies. As you can see, when we call fetch movies, we get the movies. After that, it is up to us how we display the movies. That is what we're doing over here on line number 28. We call display movies. But let's say that tomorrow you decide that, hey, I want to fetch all the movies, but I don't really want to display on the screen. I just want to display it on the console. How do we do that? Well, I'll call fetch movies. I will pass an anonymous function that takes one argument because I need to get the movies. And then I will simply say movies. And there we go. So you can see that the fetch movies now, since it is its individual function, it gets the movies. And once it gets the movies, then you decide what to do. The first time we are deciding in line number 28 that we want to display the movies on the screen. And it does display the movie. But the second time when we call on line number 32, we simply console.log the movies on the console. So that is the main reason that you will divide fetch movies into fetch movies and display movies. Now, there are other shortcuts that you can take. When we're calling fetch movies over here, we're passing this anonymous function. And this anonymous function takes one argument, right? But you can pass any function over here that takes one argument. I mean, I can call fetch movies, and I can simply pass in the signature of display movies also. And that is also going to work. And the reason it's going to work is signature over here simply means that we're not really calling display movies over here. We are simply passing in a reference to that function. So basically what's going on is that we pass into fetch movies right over here, right? And we're passing in display movies. So this movies fetch callback is going to be looking at, or is going to be pointing to display movies, because it does satisfy the criteria of one argument. So here we invoke it on the one argument, and you can also see that the display movies also supports one argument. Actually, that's the only thing you can pass in over there. So that is how you can even, restrict it. Not restrict it, but you can even concise it much further. It's like even more compact. All right. Now, which approach do you want to use? Do you want to go with this one, or do you want to go with this one? It's just a matter of choice. Both are perfectly fine. So now we have taken a look at how callbacks work, and we were also able to separate the concerns with fetching versus displaying. Now fetch movies is only fetching the information, and display movies is only displaying the information.